In the beast world, they say, a man-eating monster is imprisoned in the Forbidden Land. The 6 tribes chose me as the bride, tied me to the sacrificial altar, and sent me into the abyss. But when I finally saw him, he just looked at me coldly and told me to run. It wasn't until later that I realized the one who truly eats people was never him. My name is Su Wan. The tribal chief's niece ran away, so the 6 tribes tied me to the altar and sent me to feed the monster in the Forbidden Land. They all say that no bride who enters the Forbidden Land has ever returned alive. But it wasn't until later that I realized the legend of the man-eating beast that had spread for 1,000 years was wrong from the very first strike. I was jolted awake by the sound of drums. The drumming felt like it was erupting from deep underground, making my chest go numb. My head throbbed with pain, and my wrists were tied behind a stone pillar with vines, digging into my skin until it burned. I was wearing nothing but a thin white veil. Torches were packed tightly all around me, and beneath my feet was a cliff, with black mist churning at the bottom of the valley. The 6 great tribes were all there. The way they looked at me wasn't like looking at a living person, but like looking at a sacrifice whose fate was already sealed. 3 days ago, I was still a junior apothecary in the wolf tribe's infirmary, setting bones and mixing herbs. When I was 5, my parents died in a beast tide, and Grandma took me in and raised me. Grandma taught me to identify herbs, boiled decoctions, and stitch wounds, saying my hands were steady, making me well-suited to be an apothecary. I had originally thought I would live a quiet life in the infirmary forever, but when the chief's niece ran away, I, having no parents, no backing, and having offended the chief, became the most convenient scapegoat. It was only then that I understood. In the eyes of the 6 tribes, a sacrifice isn't even considered a person. Whoever is unlucky is the one who must be pushed out to take the fall for everyone else. When they pushed me into the black mist, I didn't yet know that the monster in the Forbidden Land wouldn't react by trying to eat me, but by telling me to run. The reason the chief targeted me wasn't just because I had no backing, but because last month, the chief's youngest son broke a bone while hunting. After I set it for him, the chief's men came to the infirmary, trying to take Grandma's emergency stash of herbs. I stopped them. I told them those herbs were reserved for those injured in the beast tides. The chief's son wasn't missing any limbs, so standard bone-setting herbs were enough. After that was reported back, I was marked for revenge. The day the chief's men came to grab me, Grandma blocked the door, but was knocked down by 2 hunters with a single shove. I lunged to help her up, and was struck on the back of the head with a club. When I woke up, I was already on the altar. The high priest in gray robes held his bone staff, reciting the sacrificial text in public, saying that I, Su Wan, an orphan of the wolf tribe, 19 years of age, offer my body to the beast, and my blood to quell the disaster. With a cloth stuffed in my mouth, I could only whimper. After he finished the text, he suddenly leaned down and whispered in a voice only I could hear, "Once you're inside, don't stop. Keep walking. The faster you walk, the sooner it will be over." That wasn't pity. It was a warning. It was only then that I understood. He didn't not know how people died in here. He knew all too well. As the sacrificial chant ended, the burly men dragged me toward the stone path. Grandma rushed over, crying out, "She is only 19. Think of how many lives she saved from the medicine hut." But as the torches illuminated face after face, not a single person dared to speak up for me. I spat out the cloth in my mouth and gave Grandma a small smile. "Don't cry. You raised me for 14 years. I've already gotten more than my share." The next instant, I was shoved violently into the black mist. In that moment, I finally understood. The high priest wasn't afraid I'd die too slowly. He was afraid I would find out how I was going to die. The stone path was incredibly slick. I walked inside barefoot, every step feeling like treading on blades. After the time it takes for a stick of incense to burn, a 30-foot-tall stone gate appeared in the mist. The gate was covered in glowing red runes, with only a narrow slit open. I squeezed through sideways. The first thing I smelled wasn't the stench of a beast, but the scent of old, dried blood. 2 steps further in, I saw bones. Human bones. Some curled up, others shattered into pieces. They were scattered all the way from the entrance to the middle section. Beside the 3rd skeleton, on the stone wall, there were 5 deep claw marks. Each one was longer than my forearm, and they were clawed from the inside out. My heart sank. I continued forward and heard the clanking of chains. In the shadows, a pair of dark golden vertical pupils suddenly lit up. He was held in place by iron chains, silver hair draped over his shoulders. His chest and arms were covered in scars and black runes. 2 short horns on his head made it perfectly clear to me that this was the legendary beast. Yet, when he saw me, his first words were, "Another one here to die. Get out." I stared at him, not moving for a long time. On his wrists, besides the chafing from the chains, there were circles of overlapping bite marks, both old and new. I asked him, "Did you eat those people?" He looked at me coldly. "I don't eat people. I only need blood. And that blood has always been my own." I stood there, unable to say a word for a long time. The beast the 6 tribes spoke of, in whispers, his first reaction to seeing me wasn't to pounce and tear me apart, but to tell me to get out quickly. This anomaly alone was more terrifying than the bones. The 1,000-year-old legend of the beast, right here, was proven wrong at the very first strike. Instead, I followed the rock crevices and found spring water and medicinal herbs, mineral moss, ice soul mushroom. After grinding them into a green paste, I walked to within 3 steps of him. Your wrists are infected. I am a healer. He stared at the paste, as if looking at a bowl of poison. But before he could chase me away again, the black and red runes on his body suddenly flared up. His breathing grew ragged. The chains rattled instantly. He lunged forward, only to be yanked back by the chains. His entire body was trembling. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was fighting to restrain himself. The next moment, his form began to swell. His roar shook dust from the ceiling. I was so terrified my limbs went numb, but when the fear reached its peak, only one thought remained. I rushed forward and slapped the herbal paste directly onto the wound on his wrist. With a sizzling sound, the medicinal properties erupted in black smoke, as if swallowed by something. That force traveled up my fingertips and drilled straight into the back of my hand. I was thrown back violently, crashing into a stone pillar, and everything went black. When I lifted my hand, my right hand, from fingertip to wrist, already had a thin, black mark on it. Xuanming suddenly regained his senses. He stared at that mark, and for the first time, his eyes showed genuine panic. He wasn't afraid of losing control himself. He was afraid that I too had been bitten by this curse. He said this black mark would grow, and it would keep growing. I kept up a brave front, but in my heart, I knew clearly I hadn't found a way to survive yet, but I had already touched his weak spot. What was even more dire was that, when Xuanming looked at that black mark, the look on his face for the first time wasn't ferocity, it was fear. He wasn't afraid of me dying by his hand. He was afraid that from now on, I would be like him, dragged alive into the abyss by this thing. The next day, I entered the corridor again, beside the 3rd skeleton. I finally saw some writing. My name is Alwyn, of the Deer tribe. The 3rd day. The fog is getting thicker. I haven't seen the beast. The last line was crooked and shaky. The walls were glowing. I looked up at the runes, and it all made sense. These girls didn't die in front of Xuanming at all, but died in the corridor. Died on this glowing, life-draining path, and the claw marks beside the skeletons weren't from lunging at the sacrifices, but from desperately reaching toward them when Alwyn was dying. Xuanming must have heard her. He broke his chains and reached out his claws, tearing the stone wall to shreds. Yet, he was still 3 feet short. I crouched before those claw marks, my nose stinging with tears. After returning to the center, I stared at Xuanming for a long time. The claw marks in the corridor are yours. You wanted to save them, but you couldn't reach them. Xuanming was silent for a long time, and finally said only 3 words, 3 feet short. As those 3 words fell, a chill ran down my spine. 1,200 years, 12 girls. Every time, he was only 3 feet short. It wasn't that he didn't want to save them, it was that he could never reach them. Those 3 feet, instantly. From a legendary beast, back to a man, trapped in chains. I wrapped a wet cloth around a stone strip, and from 3 steps away, I tended to his wounds. He didn't pull away, nor did he drive me off, as if he had accepted it. At least this time, Summoné had finally understood what those claw marks were saying. Only then did I realize that the so-called beast was nothing more than a man, who time and again fell short by 3 feet, unable to save anyone. By the 10th day, the black markings on my right hand had still not faded. Xuanming had set rules for me. I couldn't touch him. I couldn't touch the chains, and I couldn't touch the runes. I agreed on the surface, but secretly, I kept testing. The medicinal properties of the moss were consumed, but the spring water was not. That meant the issue wasn't the contact itself, but the medicinal nature of it. During another one of his episodes, I crouched at a safe distance, and suddenly noticed something. Whenever I approached within 3 steps, the heaving of his chest would slow down. I held my hand, an inch from his shoulder. Even though I didn't touch him, the crimson runes on his body dimmed bit by bit. At the same time, the black markings on my hand glowed as well, as if sharing his burden. Xuanming stared at my hand, his voice raspy. "You are trading your life for this," I replied. "It is better than dying for nothing." His expression suddenly darkened, asking me who told me that my life wasn't worth anything. Later, he spoke of 1,200 years ago, when the Black Abyss first tore open. He had volunteered to be the anchor for the seal. The first high priest promised to save him. The second told him to wait a little longer, but the third said nothing at all, and simply sent the first sacrifice. I asked him, when he discovered the runes were draining lives, had he ever thought of just breaking the chains and letting the Black Abyss swallow everything outside? He said he had thought about it, but the ones who deserved to die were those people, not those girls, who knew nothing at all. Only then did I understand that what the people outside truly feared was never the disaster itself, but losing the comfort of having someone suffer in their stead. So those sent in by the 6 clans were never sacrifices. They were people paying for their sins. On the 13th day, footsteps suddenly echoed in the corridor. Not the clanking of chains, not the wind, but the breathing of living people. I rushed in and saw Uncle Liu, along with another unconscious hunter. Both of their faces were deathly pale, and they were trembling all over. When Uncle Liu saw me, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. He stammered that the high priest had sent them in to check if the sacrifice was dead and to see if the seal was still functioning. So they hadn't come to save me. They were just here to check if this man, eating rune, was still running. The humming of the stone walls grew heavier. The unconscious hunter's face was turning gray. I didn't have time to think. I pressed my right hand against the rune. The black markings and the rune lit up at the same time, like two things of the same origin. They clashed violently. That small section of the stone wall flickered intensely, and the suction actually weakened. I dragged Uncle Liu, propped up the other hunter, and stumbled toward the exit. Only when we rushed out of the passage, and the 3 of us fell to the ground, did that suction suddenly vanish. Uncle Liu looked at the black markings on my arm, then at the bones scattered everywhere, and finally understood how the previous sacrifices had actually died. When he knelt down, it wasn't to admit his own fault, but because he finally saw how those girls in the past had really died. Su Wan, I'm sorry. I didn't scold him. I just shoved Grandma's rattan cane into his hands, telling him to take the truth back out. That kneeling, it didn't just shatter his pride. It shattered their century-old self-deceiving legends. After he squeezed through the stone gate, I turned back and realized Xuanming had been standing at the end of the chains, having heard everything. The blood moon grew rounder day by day. The 15th day, Xuanming suffered for a full hour. The black markings had also crept up to my forearm. The 17th day, deep in the forbidden grounds, I felt a hidden crack covered by rubble. Inside lay a stone chamber, the walls covered in ancient beast-era script. The black abyss cannot be destroyed, only sealed. The seal requires an anchor, a lock, a flame. But what truly made me tremble wasn't these technical terms, but the passage that followed. In the original design, human sacrifice was never needed. Each of the 6 tribes would send 1 practitioner a year to perform a spirit infusion ritual before the stone gate, taking only half a day. No bride was needed, and no one needed to die. But the latter half of the stone wall had been chiseled away. I followed the crack and pulled a bamboo scroll from a hidden compartment. It was the notes of the past high priests, the words left by the 3rd generation, were as cold as settling an account. It wasn't that the plan was unfeasible. It was that the 6 tribes found it troublesome. The eagle tribe said they couldn't spare anyone. The bear tribe said they lacked practitioners. The deer tribe complained the road was too long, and the other tribes made excuses to one another. No one was willing to put in that half day of effort. So the high priest used 1 human life to trade for 100 years of ease. What was even more ruthless was, the scroll stated it clearly. The 6 tribes agreed unanimously. No one was forced, and no one was truly helpless. They simply weighed the cost of spending half a day each year against letting a girl die for 100 years, wondering which was more convenient. And then they chose the latter. This so-called destiny was nothing more than people too lazy to save others themselves, letting someone else die for 100 years. The words later in the scroll made me feel sick with cold. The 5th generation wrote, "Fear is more useful than virtue." The 8th generation wrote, "Divine authority is built on fear. Without a wicked beast, how could there be divine authority?" Only then did I realize, 1200 years ago, they did it out of laziness. And later, to maintain their power, they weren't offering sacrifices to the heavens. They were using the lives of 12 girls to build their own altars. On the 20th day, Xuanming's beast transformation was more violent than ever before. The chains had cracked in several places. The black markings spread past his wrists, and even on the ring finger of my left hand, a thin thread began to emerge. He suddenly told me to leave, saying he could still open the stone door, and told me to take the bamboo slips and go, to tell those outside that the seal could no longer hold. I asked him if he was the one who had erased those words on the stone wall. He said yes, that was an ancient marriage contract, using blood as the medium, to enter into a marriage vow, to share the curse, and to recast the seal. The price was that the one who bore the final calamity would almost certainly die. When the first high priest told him of this method, his first reaction was not to seek his own survival, but to ask what would happen to the other person. Upon learning the cost was too high, he personally ground away the stone wall, choosing to be locked away for 10,000 years rather than let anyone else die in his place. Only then did I understand that what he had erased was not just a marriage contract, but also the final path that could have saved him. He had personally destroyed his own way out, just so no one else would lose their life for him. Yet, a man like this has been cursed as a wicked beast for 1200 years, but this time, I will be the one to settle the score for him. When I emerged from the forbidden grounds, the blood moon had already climbed halfway across the sky. The sacrificial altar was empty. Only the ashes of torches remained on the ground. I ran down the mountain barefoot and charged into the Eagle clan's council hall. When the elders saw me, Their faces changed instantly. They weren't shocked that I was alive. They were shocked that I could actually walk out of there, alive. I stated my name, held the bamboo slips high, and smashed the truth before them all. The original seal only required the 6 clans to take turns channeling energy, half a day each year, with no need for anyone to die. By the 3rd generation, the 6 clans found it troublesome, and none were willing to put in that half day of effort. So the high priest took a human life to replace a century of responsibility. At this moment, Uncle Liu arrived as well. He testified before everyone, saying the runes in the passage were life-draining, and that those sacrifices were never eaten by any wicked beast, but were instead drained dry by the glowing stone walls. The people in the hall turned pale, one after another. They finally realized that those sacrifices weren't eaten, but were sent in by their own hands, to be drained to death by the runes. Xuang also ran to find me, saying that Su Wan was her grandmother's sister. Her whole family had always believed that Su Wan had been eaten by the beast. I told her, no, with red-rimmed eyes. Xuang stuffed a bag of ice soul mushrooms into my arms, begging me to come back alive. I tucked away the water and dried rations, and turned to leave. Xuanming had been alone in the Forbidden Land for 1,200 years. It was finally time for these people outside to know the truth. The one who truly deserved to die was never him. The heavenly mandate they had preached for a millennium, in the end, was nothing more than a fig leaf to hide their shame. The path back was 10 times harder than the way out. The thick fog was scorching. The stone path burned my feet. With every step I took, it felt like treading on hot coals. By the time I reached the stone gate, it was already beginning to close. I squeezed through the side, and the runes in the passage all glowed a deep crimson, one by one, like red-hot iron wires, embedded in the stone walls. The ones Su Wan carved back then. The walls were glowing right before my eyes. My vitality was being drained away rapidly, my skin turning cold from the inside out. I had no choice but to run, until the soles of my shoes were worn through, until my knees gave way, and I collapsed onto the stone floor. My palms blistered from the heat, my knees scraped raw by the gravel. I finally understood how Su Wan had died, and how the 12 girls before her had met their ends. They all fell on this very path, without even seeing Xuanming's face. But I couldn't stop. I gritted my teeth and crawled forward, leaving a long trail of blood behind me, until I crossed the final stretch of the passage, and rolled into the central chamber. When I looked up, Xuanming was no longer in human form. 3 chains had snapped. His silver-white beast tail flared out, his horns fully grown, his eyes filled with scarlet. The black abyss stone gate behind him had cracked open, dark red liquid seeping out, billowing with black smoke. Yet, when I called his name and walked toward him step by step, even in his madness, he managed to pause for a moment. In his scarlet beast eyes, a flicker of dark gold emerged. Through gritted teeth, he forced out a few broken words. Don't come any closer. The marriage contract will kill you. Even when driven to the point of pure instinct, his first reaction was still to keep me away. But those few words were enough. Even at the very last moment, he was still shielding me from himself. I continued forward. His tail swept across, tearing my sleeve against my shoulder, blood instantly gushing out. But what truly made me stop was not the pain, but the new fissure on the ground, right between him and me. He had used his claws to tear a deep gash into the stone floor, 3 feet wide, not reaching outward, but clawed right beneath his own feet. Even in his madness, his subconscious was still holding himself back, crossing this line 1,200 years, 12 times, falling short by 3 feet. Every single time, he forced himself to stay firmly behind those 3 feet. I looked down and stepped right over. I reached out and touched the chains that hadn't fully shattered yet. The black markings glowed from my fingertips up to my shoulder, as if they had finally found their way back. I took the last 2 steps, stood before him, and cradled his burning face in my hands. I pressed my forehead against his. His scarlet beast eyes were locked onto mine. Yet, he didn't bite down. The beast bone pendant on my ankle, at that very moment, shattered silently. I pressed my right hand against him, letting the black markings flow into the marriage contract. I didn't come here to die for you. I didn't come here to be a sacrifice. I came here to take you home. In that instant, the scarlet in his eyes seemed to be held back by those words for a fleeting moment. The chains behind me rattled wildly. The runes on the stone walls lit up, one by one. The entire forbidden ground felt as if its throat had been seized. 1,200 years, 12 times falling short by 3 feet. But this time, I walked those last 3 feet for him. Once the marriage contract opened, the curse poured into me like a flood, but I wasn't just resisting it. I was channeling it, like draining toxins from a feverish patient. I drew the burning sickness from his heart to my limbs, and then forced it out of my body, bit by bit. The curse within Xuanming peeled away, layer by layer. The chains snapped one by one, but the final disaster rushed straight toward me. The black markings burned within my bones, retreating from my shoulder all the way back to my fingertips. I didn't dodge. Instead, I followed its path, guiding it along. 20 days of testing the poison, 20 days of suppressing the curse at close range. I had long since figured out the pattern of this thing. curses of the same origin, finally latched onto each other, devouring one another, until they were both exhausted. Everything went black before my eyes, and I could barely stand. His arms, no longer bound by chains, held me completely for the first time. Xuanming's voice trembled more violently than during any of his beast transformations. Su Wan, don't leave me. Please? What finally fell onto my face wasn't blood, it was his tears. When I woke up again, the first thing I saw was sunlight, real sunlight, warm, bright. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and grass. Xuanming was sitting right beside me. No chains, no runes, no sharp claws or beast horns. I stared at him for a long time, not even daring to breathe too heavily. But when I woke up and saw the sunlight, my first reaction wasn't joy, but disbelief. He had truly survived. The man who had been locked away for 1,200 years had truly emerged from the black abyss. The evil beast who had been cursed for 1,200 years finally had the chance to be human again. I want to sit up. Xuanming reached out to help, nearly pulling my entire body straight into his arms. Once I actually leaned into him, he stiffened again. After a long moment, he slowly wrapped his arms around me, resting his chin gently on the top of my head, like a beast that finally dared to get close to someone, not knowing where to put his hands. Once I had regained my strength, I began to cross-examine him. Can you cook? No. Can you hunt? I suppose so. I nodded, and solemnly assigned him his chores. Brewing medicine, chopping wood, fetching water, washing dishes. 2 hours every day. I'll provide room and board, but no wages. I deliberately kept a straight face and brought up another matter. You said before that I was nothing. That remark, I still remember it. Xuanming was silent for a long time, before whispering an apology. He said he only wanted to force me to leave back then, forgetting that even lies can hurt people. I had intended to keep pushing him, but seeing him, like that, clearly stiff, with nervousness, yet forcing himself to appear calm, I couldn't bring myself to say a harsh word. Then he looked at me and said, word by word, you were the first not to scream in my presence, the first to dress my wounds, the first to be hurt by the curse, and still refuse to leave, and also the first to crawl back from the glowing passage. By the end of it, his Adam's apple bobbed slightly. Su Wan, you are my wife. The very second he uttered those two words, a deep, thunderous roar echoed from the valley in the distance. The forbidden land of a millennium began to collapse. The moment the stone gate crumbled, the people of the 6 tribes all came running out. The black mist dissipated, and for the first time, real sunlight pierced the valley. The high priest arrived on the scene as well, but as he looked at the mist, that was vanishing away. The expression on his face was not joy, but terror. Because if the seal could be recast, it meant that everything he had insisted on, they must die, had been a lie all along. He tried to raise his staff again, to use that rhetoric of heaven's will, to suppress the people once more. But Uncle Liu had already stepped forward. In front of the 6 tribes, he recited that passage from the 3rd-generation priest, word for word. If the 6 tribes refuse to contribute and exchange a human life, the king beast must not know of this, passed down through generations, never to be broken. With every word he spoke, the atmosphere among the crowd grew heavier. A Shuang's 90-year-old grandmother was helped to the front, and with a trembling voice, she asked, was a Luan never eaten by the beast at all? An old woman of the bear tribe, clutching her granddaughter, said her own mother had also been a sacrifice hundreds of years ago. Those names buried by heaven's will for 1,200 years were finally, one by one, were called out once again. Some called for their mothers, some called for their sisters. Others didn't even know the names of their kin, only remembering that their families had once been short a bride. The crowd wasn't silent. It was filled with the sound of stifled gasps, shame, speechlessness, inability to stand. Those reactions that should have come much sooner had finally arrived. The high priest opened his mouth, but not a single word could suppress the hearts of the people. He had spent his whole life using destiny to suppress others, but once the truth came out, the very word, destiny, was the first thing to crush him. The old debts you suppressed for 1,200 years have finally returned to settle the score. The first one to step forward was Auntie Chun. She was the very same Auntie Chun who, when her daughter had a high fever, relied on me to bring it down. On the day of the sacrifice, she had kept her head down, not daring to look at me. Now, she walked step by step toward the high priest, raised her hand, and wiped away a streak of the totem on his face, with the paint smeared across her palm. What was revealed underneath was nothing more than a pale, aging human face, not a messenger of the gods. Never had been. The high priest was forced to retreat, his back against the very cliff where countless sacrifices had been held. His staff slipped from his hand, crashing to the ground, and no one bothered to pick it up. 3 days later, the sacrificial altar was dismantled piece by piece. Hunters grabbed their axes, hacking at the stone pillars, one by one, as if they were hacking away at this 1,000-year-old excuse. The women tore apart the vines that had bound the sacrifices. Children threw the rubble down into the valley, stone by stone. Everyone did only one thing: to erase that place that had harmed people for 1200 years. From the face of the earth, no one mentioned the rules anymore, and no one mentioned the will of the gods. They finally understood that as long as this place stood, it was like an old debt hanging over their heads. The 6 tribes established a new covenant. Every year, each tribe would send one practitioner to the old site to perform a spirit infusion ritual. Half a day is enough. No sacrifices are needed. No brides are needed. And no one else needs to die. It turns out that from the very beginning, things should have been this simple. From now on, the bottom of the valley should see light, not the corpses of brides, nor the generations of brides, dragged there to die. And on the other side of the prairie, the door to the herb cottage had been given a fresh coat of paint. Grandma sat by the door soaking up the sun, cradling a white cat in her arms. When she saw me return, she first scolded me for having such a stubborn life, and then her eyes turned red. Xuanming stood silently behind me, his long silver hair tousled by the wind, standing as tall as a wall. Grandma looked him up and down, and finally, just let out a huff. Can you even walk when you're hurt like that? Come in, I've tidied up the woodshed. It is cold at night. I'll add a fur for you. Soon, next to the herb cottage, a newly built woodshed appeared. The craftsmanship wasn't great. The walls were a bit crooked, but it was sturdy enough. After Xuanming came out of the Forbidden Land, the first thing he learned wasn't how to be a beast king, but rather how to honestly help out around the herbal clinic. The first time he chopped wood with a single swing of the axe, he split both the firewood and the stone stump in two. Later, he helped me carry the medicine chest, watched the fire for Grandma, and chased the rabbits that kept nibbling the herbs away from the clinic door. Occasionally, he would put the mineral moss on the wrong shelf, only to be scolded by me. From across the courtyard, Grandma would complain that he was clumsy, but she would always serve him an extra half bowl of soup. Even that white cat finally dared to rub against his legs. He still wakes up in a cold sweat sometimes at night, instinctively reaching for the old scars on his wrists. But when he pushes the door open, there are no chains outside, only the light of the clinic, the sound of Grandma's coughing, and my voice scolding him for stacking the firewood too high. The Beast King from 1200 years ago now stands under the eaves of the clinic, learning how to live a normal life. That evening, I was preparing medicine behind the clinic, calling out to Xuanming through the window, telling him to put the mineral lotus on the third shelf and not to put it on the second one again. He was silent for a moment, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. It wasn't the kind of smile of ice frozen for 1200 years, finally cracking open, but the natural smile of a man who is just living his life after being nagged. Just then, a fallen leaf was blown down by the wind, landing right in his palm. A man who hadn't felt the wind for 1200 years stood there in the breeze, looking down at that perfectly ordinary leaf. For a long time, I didn't ask him what he was thinking. I just walked over and shoved a freshly roasted sweet potato into his other hand. The heat startled him back to reality. A leaf in his left hand, a sweet potato in his right. Holding them both with care, a gentle breeze swept through the courtyard, the scent of herbs, the scent of firewood, and the sweet aroma of the potato, all mingled together. His old scars are still there, and my right hand still goes numb, occasionally. Not every wound can heal overnight, but from today on, there will be no new ones. The bottom of the valley finally sees the light. Those brides who died are finally no longer just sacrifices. Whether it is a Luan or those whose names were never left behind, they are no longer just the next bride in line, and Xuanming no longer has to bear the name of a monster, carrying the sins of others. Those buried names, finally, have someone to remember them. As for me, from the day I was tied to the sacrificial altar, I never thought I would be able to return to the world of the living. But now I know, some people come out alive, not to forget, but to bear witness to the truth for everyone else. He no longer has to stand 3 feet away and watch anyone die.